An elderly woman walks into a five-star hotel, but instead of a warm welcome, she's met with suspicion, judgment, and humiliation. What the arrogant concierge doesn't know. She's the mother of one of the most powerful men in the world. As tension builds and whispers spread, a towering figure steps forward, and the entire room shifts. Will justice be served? Or will silence speak louder than words? One mistake, one viral moment, and lives will change forever. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The Grand Horizon Hotel stood as a monument to extravagance. Its entrance gleamed under the morning sun, the towering glass doors reflecting the rush of luxury cars pulling up to the valet. The marble floors inside shone like mirrors, and an enormous chandelier cascaded golden light over the pristine white walls. The lobby was a symphony of quiet elegance, hushed conversations, the occasional clink of crystal glasses, and the soft hum of a grand piano tucked into the corner. Every detail was curated for the elite, for those who measured success in private jets and exclusive club memberships. Through the grand entrance, an elderly woman stepped inside. Lucille O'Neal carried herself with a quiet dignity, her presence unassuming yet commanding in its own way. Dressed in a simple but elegant navy blue dress, her gray-streaked hair neatly pinned back, she moved with grace, despite the slight stiffness in her gait. She clutched a small handbag, her fingers running over the edges as she took in her surroundings. To the guests and staff around her, she was invisible. Just another old woman, perhaps someone's grandmother who had wandered in by mistake. But Lucille knew exactly where she was and why she had come. At the front desk, a young man in a tailored navy suit and polished Italian loafers stood with his arms crossed, a well-practiced smile on his lips. Chase Donovan, the hotel's lead concierge, prided himself on maintaining the exclusivity of the Grand Horizon. He had seen it all: celebrities demanding privacy, billionaires throwing tantrums, politicians making backdoor deals. He understood how power worked, and in his world, power came dressed in designer labels and million-dollar watches. Lucille reached the counter and gave a warm but firm nod. "Good morning, young man. I have a reservation." Chase barely looked up. "Are you lost, ma'am?" Lucille straightened her posture. "No, I'm exactly where I need to be." His eyes flicked up, giving her a quick, dismissive once-over. No expensive jewelry, no personal assistant, no clear sign of importance. He exhaled sharply through his nose, barely suppressing his impatience. "This hotel is very exclusive, ma'am. Perhaps you're looking for one of the restaurants nearby?" Lucille arched a brow but kept her voice even. "I have a reservation under the name O'Neal." Chase's fingers hovered over the keyboard before he sighed. "All right, let's check." His tone dripped with skepticism as he typed. The seconds stretched as he scanned the system, his expression hardening. "No reservation under that name," he said flatly, snapping the keyboard back into place. Lucille opened her handbag, pulled out a printed confirmation, and slid it across the counter. Chase took it begrudgingly, scanning it before frowning. It was legitimate. Still, his lips curled into a smirk as he set the paper down. "Interesting," he muttered. "But this must be a mistake. You see, we don't usually—" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Accommodate guests without a certain pedigree." Lucille's fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. "A certain what?" Chase's smirk widened. "This is a high-profile establishment, ma'am. We cater to a particular clientele. Are you sure you're in the right place?" A quiet tension settled between them. Lucille exhaled slowly, keeping her composure, but her dark eyes flashed with something sharp. "I believe I am," she said, her voice cool. "And I believe I paid for a suite." Chase's patience was running thin. He tapped the paper. "I'll have to verify this with management. Feel free to wait, over there." He gestured vaguely toward the seating area, as if she were an inconvenience rather than a guest. Lucille held his gaze for a long moment, before stepping away. As she turned, she caught sight of a few other guests watching the exchange. Some curious, some indifferent. She had spent decades recognizing that look. The way people silently measured others, deciding who belonged and who didn't. Taking a seat in one of the grand armchairs, Lucille smoothed her dress and glanced around. The whispers had already started. At the concierge desk, Chase muttered under his breath as he picked up the phone to call his manager. He had no idea who he had just dismissed. Across the lobby, unnoticed by most, a man entered the hotel. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed casually in a gray hoodie and sweatpants, his face partially obscured by a low-drawn cap. He stopped near the entrance, his sharp eyes scanning the room. And then, when he spotted his mother sitting alone, his expression darkened. Shaquille O'Neal had just walked in. Lucille O'Neal sat in the plush armchair, her back straight, her fingers lightly resting on her handbag. She wasn't new to judgment, but the young man's tone at the front desk had a particular bite to it, one she had encountered many times before. The type that wasn't just about class, but about something deeper, something uglier. She could feel the weight of the stares around her. Some guests had paused their conversations, glancing at her with mild curiosity before returning to their champagne flutes and hushed whispers. Others looked right through her, as if she were part of the furniture. At the front desk, Chase Donovan was still holding the printed reservation between his fingers, tapping it against the marble countertop as if debating what to do with it. He wasn't one to second-guess himself, but something about the old woman's confidence unsettled him. She wasn't groveling. She wasn't making a scene. She just sat there waiting, like she expected him to correct his mistake. That irritated him. With a dismissive sigh, he grabbed the phone and dialed the manager's line. "Victoria, hey." "Yeah, I've got a situation here," he said, turning slightly away as he spoke. "There's this older woman at the desk claiming she has a reservation, but I don't think she belongs here. Looks like a mix-up. Thought I'd run it by you before I deal with it." Lucille caught his side glance as he spoke, the way his lip curled slightly, as if even discussing her presence was a chore. She exhaled slowly, keeping her expression neutral. Chase nodded at whatever response he received and hung up. He turned back to her with a thin smile. "Our manager will be down shortly to, clarify things. In the meantime, I'll have to ask you not to linger in the lobby." Lucille raised an eyebrow. "I'm not lingering. I'm waiting for my room." Chase's smile didn't waver, but his tone tightened. "We have policies, ma'am. Certain standards. If you don't have business here, we can't have people sitting around." Lucille leaned forward slightly, her voice as smooth as polished stone. "And what business do you think I have here?" Chase let out a short, humorless chuckle. "I don't know. Maybe looking for someone to help you out? A handout, perhaps?" His eyes flicked to her modest handbag, the worn edges of its leather. "Or maybe you just wandered in off the street." A murmur rippled through the lobby. Not loud, but enough. Some guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the undercurrent of something they weren't sure they wanted to be a part of. Lucille didn't flinch. She had raised 4 children, faced struggles that a man like Chase wouldn't last a day in, and built a life that had taken her farther than he could ever imagine. She slowly rose to her feet, locking eyes with him. "I don't need a handout, young man. I have a reservation. I paid for a room, and I expect to be treated like any other guest in this hotel." Chase exhaled through his nose, still smirking. "I don't think you understand, ma'am. This isn't the kind of place where you can just book a room online and show up. We cater to a very specific clientele." The words dripped with condescension, but the meaning behind them was crystal clear. Lucille tilted her head, studying him like he was an unruly child. And what kind of clientele would that be? Chase opened his mouth, but before he could answer, the hotel's glass doors swung open, and 2 uniformed security guards stepped in. The shift in energy was instant. Conversations quieted. Heads turned. Even the sound of the grand piano in the corner seemed to falter. Lucille's jaw tightened, but she remained rooted in place. She had been in enough rooms, in enough situations to recognize what was happening. Chase wasn't just dismissing her. He was trying to remove her. One of the security guards, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a shaved head, walked up to Chase. "You called us?" Chase nodded, keeping his voice deliberately low, but not low enough. "Yeah, we've got a situation. She doesn't have a valid reservation, and she's refusing to leave." Lucille inhaled deeply, a slow, steady breath. That's a lie. The taller security guard glanced between them, then at the paper still on the counter. He hesitated. He didn't seem as eager as Chase to escalate things. The other guard, a younger man with sharp features, was already shifting forward slightly, ready to act. Lucille noticed the way their fingers twitched near their radios, how they were waiting for the smallest sign to move. It was always the same. The assumptions, the unspoken decisions about who belonged and who didn't. The younger guard took another step forward. "Ma'am, we're going to have to ask you to, is there a problem?" The voice was deep, low. It didn't have to be loud to carry across the entire lobby. The security guards froze. Chase stiffened. Lucille turned her head slowly, and a smile, small but certain, touched her lips. Shaquille O'Neal stood near the entrance, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. He wasn't in a suit, wasn't draped in the flashy attire that celebrities often wore. Just a hoodie, sweatpants, and a pair of sneakers. But he didn't need expensive clothes to own the room. The tension shifted, like a storm front rolling in. Chase blinked, his mouth opening slightly as his mind caught up with his eyes. A flicker of recognition. The shift from arrogance to uncertainty. Shaq stepped forward, his steps slow, deliberate. His towering frame made even the spacious lobby seem smaller. His gaze locked onto Chase's with a quiet intensity that was far more intimidating than shouting ever could be. Lucille watched her son approach, her eyes shining with something unreadable. She said nothing. She didn't have to. Chase, suddenly feeling very exposed, cleared his throat. Mr. O'Neal, He hesitated, scrambling for the right words. I didn't realize. Shaq didn't blink. Didn't realize what? Chase swallowed. That she was my mother. Shaq finished for him, his voice calm but weighted. The color drained from Chase's face. His carefully crafted composure cracked, and for the first time, a flicker of real fear crept into his expression. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The lobby was dead silent now. Even the guests who had pretended not to notice were hanging on to every second of the exchange. Shaq finally broke eye contact with Chase, shifting his gaze to the security guards. "Did he call you to remove my mother?" Neither guard answered immediately. The taller one finally cleared his throat. "We were just following protocol, sir." Shaq nodded slowly, considering the words. Then, he turned back to Chase. "So, let me get this straight." He took another step forward, forcing Chase to tilt his chin up slightly to maintain eye contact. "My mother, a paying guest, walks in here, and you assume she doesn't belong. You don't check the system. You don't offer to help. You just decide she's a problem." Chase's lips parted, but Shaq wasn't done. "And then, instead of fixing your mistake, you call security." His voice remained calm, but the weight behind it was enough to make Chase visibly sweat. I didn't know," Chase stammered. Shaq tilted his head. "Didn't know she was my mother. Would it have made a difference if she wasn't?" Chase's mouth opened, then shut. Silence stretched, thick and heavy. Shaq let it linger before finally exhaling through his nose. He turned to Lucille. "You good, Mama?" Lucille gave a small, knowing smile. "I'm just fine, baby." Shaq looked back at Chase, his eyes unreadable. "We'll see about that." Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the elevators, his mother beside him. Chase stood frozen, his pulse hammering in his throat, because something told him that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The tension in the lobby was thick enough to cut. The security guards stood in awkward silence, shifting their weight from one foot to the other as Chase Donovan, still oblivious to the full gravity of the situation, squared his shoulders and continued his tirade. "You're making a scene, ma'am," Chase said, his voice louder now, as if speaking with more force would somehow make his words more legitimate. "If you don't have a confirmed reservation, we can't accommodate you. I've already asked you once to leave. Do I need to ask again?" Lucille O'Neal didn't flinch. Her years had given her wisdom, patience, and an unshakable core. She had been underestimated before, dismissed, looked down upon, but never broken. She met Chase's glare with an unwavering calm, as if daring him to push further. Across the lobby, Shaquille O'Neal stood near the entrance, unnoticed by most. He had been there long enough to witness the entire exchange, his jaw tightening as Chase's condescending voice filled the air. Dressed in a gray hoodie and sweatpants, he blended in just enough to avoid immediate recognition, though a few guests had started to murmur. "Is that Shaq?" A man near the bar whispered to his companion. "Nah, can't be," she replied, but her gaze lingered. A few feet away, a teenage boy gripped his father's sleeve. "Dad, that's Shaq, I swear." His father shushed him, still unsure. But the whispers began to spread, eyes darting toward the massive figure standing quietly by the entrance. Shaq, however, remained focused on one thing: his mother. His fingers curled into fists in the pocket of his hoodie, but he held himself back, waiting, watching. He wanted to see how far Chase would go. Chase, completely unaware of the shifting energy in the room, let out an exaggerated sigh, running a hand through his perfectly styled blonde hair. "You're making things difficult, ma'am." His voice carried across the polished marble floors, bouncing off the walls. "This is a 5-star establishment, not a shelter, not a public waiting area. Do you understand what I'm saying?" A ripple of discomfort passed through the watching guests. Some turned their heads, pretending not to notice. Others exchanged glances, as if unsure whether to step in or stay silent. A few murmured in hushed tones, but no one spoke up. Lucille let a small, knowing smile touch her lips. "Oh, I understand exactly what you're saying," she said quietly. Chase rolled his eyes, but before he could respond, a sharp voice cut through the tension. "What is going on here?" The crowd parted slightly as Victoria Langley, the hotel's manager, strode forward. She was the picture of corporate perfection: immaculate suit, sleek blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, and an expression carved from polished stone. She carried herself with an air of control, her sharp heels clicking against the floor with precision. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. Chase straightened up, smoothing his suit jacket. The security guard stepped back slightly, waiting for direction. Even the watching guests turned their attention toward her, sensing that whatever was about to happen would determine how this situation unfolded. Victoria stopped just short of Lucille and gave a tight, professional smile. "I'm Victoria Langley, the manager of Grand Horizon," she said, her tone perfectly modulated, her words carefully chosen. Her gaze flicked briefly to Chase before settling on Lucille. "I was informed there was an issue at the front desk." Chase wasted no time jumping in. "Yes, Victoria. This woman is claiming to have a reservation, but there's no record of it in our system. I've asked her to leave, but she's refusing." Victoria exhaled sharply through her nose, nodding as if she had already made her decision. "Ma'am," she said, turning back to Lucille, "I'm sure you understand that we have policies in place. If your name isn't in our system—" Lucille held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "My name is in your system," she said, her voice steady. She gestured toward the printed confirmation still sitting on the counter. "Right there." Victoria hesitated. A flicker of something unreadable crossed her face before she stepped forward, picking up the paper. She scanned it quickly, her well-trained eyes assessing every detail. A beat of silence stretched between them. Then slowly, she lowered the paper. Her grip on it tightened. Lucille watched her carefully. Shaq, still standing at a distance, saw the hesitation, the way Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. He had seen this before. That moment when someone realized they had made a mistake but didn't quite know how to fix it without losing face. Victoria's smile returned, but this time, it was different. More forced. More fragile. "I see," she said finally, placing the paper back on the counter with an air of practiced ease. "It appears there is a reservation under your name." Chase blinked. His entire posture stiffened. "Wait. What?" Victoria shot him a quick look, the kind that said, "Shut up before you make it worse." Then, turning back to Lucille, she gave a carefully measured nod. "I sincerely apologize for any inconvenience. Of course, you are welcome to your suite." Lucille studied her, waiting, letting the silence hang. Victoria's smile wavered slightly under the weight of it. "I'll personally have someone escort you to your room." Chase's face was a mixture of confusion and embarrassment. He looked from Victoria to Lucille to the watching guests, as if trying to make sense of what had just happened. "But I thought, you thought wrong," Victoria said sharply, her voice clipped. She turned to one of the security guards. "Go ahead and return to your posts." The guards hesitated for a moment before nodding and stepping away, leaving Chase standing there, red-faced and humiliated. Shaq, having seen enough, finally moved. His presence was impossible to ignore as he approached, his steps slow and deliberate. By now, more guests had recognized him. Phones were being pulled out discreetly, fingers tapping on screens as whispers turned into murmurs. Victoria turned at the movement, and for the first time, her perfectly composed expression cracked. "Mr. O'Neal," she said, startled. Shaq said nothing at first. He simply looked at her, then at Chase, then back at his mother. Lucille, ever the picture of grace, turned to Shaq with an easy smile. "Baby, I think I'm ready for my room now." Shaq's gaze lingered on Chase for one long, heavy moment. The younger man, now realizing exactly who he had been belittling, looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. Then, without a word, Shaq turned back to his mother, offering his arm. Lucille took it, her fingers resting lightly against his elbow. Victoria swallowed hard, stepping aside as they moved toward the elevator. She knew there would be consequences. This was not something that would stay contained within the polished walls of Grand Horizon. And as Shaq led his mother away, the lobby buzzed with whispers that would soon become headlines. Whispers that Chase Donovan would not be able to escape. The atmosphere in the Grand Horizon lobby had shifted. It was subtle at first, just a change in the air, an almost imperceptible ripple that moved through the room like a silent wave. The guests who had been whispering, murmuring, exchanging glances suddenly quieted, their attention drawn toward the massive figure standing near the elevators. Shaquille O'Neal had yet to speak a word, yet somehow, he had already commanded the entire room. Chase Donovan, however, remained blissfully unaware. He saw a man in a hoodie, a bystander who had probably wandered into the wrong conversation. With the same smugness that had been dripping from his voice all morning, Chase smirked and let out an amused breath. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice carrying just enough arrogance to suggest that he didn't believe the man before him was anyone of importance. Shaq didn't answer right away. His deep brown eyes, sharp and unblinking, settled on Chase with a quiet intensity that sent an unspoken message. His face was unreadable, his stance relaxed but purposeful. He had spent his entire life mastering the art of presence, of walking into a room and shifting its energy without needing to announce himself. He took a slow step forward, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the polished marble floor. His voice, when it finally came, was low and measured. "Is there a problem?" The words weren't loud, but they carried weight. For the first time that morning, Chase hesitated. Something about the way the man spoke, the steadiness of his tone, the calm authority behind it, made him pause. But only for a second. Then, recovering quickly, he let out a short, dismissive chuckle. "No problem," Chase said, shaking his head. "Just handling a situation. Nothing to concern yourself with." Shaq didn't move. He didn't blink. He didn't even break eye contact. The stillness was unsettling, thick with unspoken meaning. Lucille O'Neal, standing beside her son, could feel the storm brewing beneath his quiet demeanor. But she also knew him well enough to understand that Shaq didn't react the way people expected him to. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. She reached out, gently placing a hand on his arm. "Baby, I'm fine." Her voice was steady, unwavering, as if to tell him, "I've handled worse." But that wasn't the point. The damage was already done. Shaq's gaze flickered to her for the briefest moment, his jaw tightening. Then, he turned back to Chase. The lobby had gone completely still. Guests who had once been engaged in their own affairs were now transfixed, watching with bated breath. The staff behind the concierge desk had frozen, sensing the shift in hierarchy. And Chase, finally, started to realize that something was off. He frowned, tilting his head slightly. His smirk faltered. His confidence wavered just a little. He glanced around, noticing the way people were looking at the man in the hoodie. the way the room had fallen silent. And then, slowly, recognition started to creep into his expression. His eyes flicked up, past the hoodie, past the casual sweatpants, and landed on the unmistakable face of the man he had just dismissed as a nobody. His breath caught. The smirk disappeared. The blood drained from his face. "Oh!" The word barely made it past his lips. He swallowed hard. "Oh! Shaq didn't let him finish. He took another step forward, closing the space between them just enough to remind Chase of their difference in size, not just in height, but in presence, in power. The hotel manager, Victoria Langley, who had been standing stiffly to the side, finally found her voice. "Mr. O'Neal," she said quickly, forcing a tight smile. I assure you, this was just a misunderstanding." Shaq's eyes flicked to her, and she visibly stiffened under his gaze. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated, his tone neutral but layered with something sharp underneath. Victoria hesitated, glancing at Chase, who looked like he wanted to evaporate into thin air. "Yes, of course," she rushed on. "I wasn't aware of the full situation. If I had known—" Shaq tilted his head slightly. "Known what?" Victoria stopped. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Shaq let the silence stretch between them. He had learned a long time ago that silence was a weapon. He didn't need to yell, didn't need to create a scene. All he had to do was let people sit with their own discomfort. Let them feel the weight of their own words, their own actions. Chase, now visibly sweating, took a shaky step back. I didn't mean any offense," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just thought—" "What did you think?" Shaq asked, his voice still impossibly calm. Chase's mouth opened and closed, but no answer came. Because there wasn't a good one. The entire room had seen it, the judgment, the assumption. The way he had dismissed Lucille without even bothering to check her reservation. The way he had called security on her simply because she didn't look like she belonged. And now, standing before one of the most recognizable figures in the world, he realized that there was no talking his way out of it. Shaq let the silence do its work for a few more seconds, before finally exhaling. Then, in a voice barely above a murmur, he said, "You should be careful who you look down on." Chase flinched like he'd been struck. Shaq didn't wait for a response. He turned to his mother and gently extended his arm. "Let's go, Mama." Lucille, ever the picture of grace, nodded. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk. She simply held her head high as she took her son's arm. Together, they moved toward the elevators, leaving behind a lobby full of people who had just witnessed something far more powerful than any raised voice or angry outburst. They had witnessed the power of silence, of dignity, of a presence so strong it didn't need to be loud to be heard. And Chase Donovan, for the first time in his privileged life, had been forced to listen. Victoria Langley's face shifted like a politician caught off guard. One moment she had been stiff and composed, playing along with Chase's dismissiveness. The next, she was plastering on the most artificial professional smile money could buy. "Mr. O'Neal," she said quickly, stepping forward as if she could undo everything that had just transpired. "I'm so sorry about this. I had no idea you were—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "With us today." Shaq didn't move. His eyes remained steady, unblinking, watching her like a scientist studying a specimen under glass. Victoria's hands twitched at her sides. "Had I known your mother was checking in, I would have ensured everything was handled properly." She shot a quick glare at Chase, who was still standing frozen behind the counter. "This is not how we do things at Grand Horizon." Shaq tilted his head slightly. "Not how you do things." His voice was soft, controlled. Victoria's smile faltered. "Well, of course not," she said quickly. This was a misunderstanding. Lucille O'Neal, standing poised beside her son, exhaled softly. "Misunderstandings tend to happen a lot to people who look like me," she said. Her tone wasn't bitter. It didn't need to be. It was a simple truth. A hush fell over the lobby again, heavier this time. The weight of it was suffocating. Chase, still struggling to grasp the severity of the situation, let out a nervous laugh. "Look, I don't know why this is getting blown out of proportion," he said, trying to recover some of his lost ground. His eyes flicked to Shaq, to Victoria, then back to the guests who were still watching. I was just doing my job. She looked out of place. And come on, you can't blame me for thinking. He stopped himself too late. The words had already left his mouth. A few guests gasped. One woman near the bar muttered, "Oh my God," under her breath. Even Victoria, as calculated as she was, paled slightly. Lucille inhaled sharply but didn't speak. She didn't have to. Shaq's expression didn't change, not even a flicker. He simply turned his full attention to Chase, taking one slow step forward. The younger man swallowed hard. "Out of place?" Shaq repeated, his voice almost too quiet to hear. Chase's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He could feel the stares now, the way the entire room had turned against him in an instant. Shaq didn't let him off the hook. "You looked at my mother," he said slowly, "and you decided she didn't belong." Chase's throat bobbed. I just assumed." "You assumed she was lost," Shaq continued, his voice smooth, methodical. "Assumed she didn't have money. Assumed she wasn't the type of person who stays in your hotel." Chase's breathing had turned shallow. He wanted to disappear, to backtrack, to explain himself, but there was no way out now. Shaq let the silence stretch again, making him sit with it, letting the discomfort do the work. Then, he asked the one question that cut deeper than anything else. "Would you have treated her the same way if she looked like you?" Chase's face drained of all color. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Shaq didn't break eye contact. No security call. No attitude. No assumptions, Shaq said, his voice impossibly calm. "You'd have asked for ID, checked the system, apologized for any mix-up. But you didn't. Because you already decided she wasn't worth the time." Chase's hands clenched into fists. "That's not..." Shaq held up a hand, silencing him. "You can lie to yourself if it makes you feel better. But we all know the truth." A thick, suffocating silence followed. Chase's lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. His shoulders were drawn tight, his jaw locked. But the worst part wasn't the shame. It was the fact that everyone in the lobby, every guest, every staff member, saw him for exactly what he was. Victoria, still trying to salvage what was left of the hotel's dignity, stepped in. "I'll be handling this immediately," she said, her voice stiff, clipped. "Mr. Donovan, I need to see you in my office. Now." Chase, his face burning with humiliation, nodded once, curtly, before turning on his heel and walking away. He didn't meet anyone's eyes. Victoria turned back to Shaq, her smile forced. "Again, my sincerest apologies. This will not go unaddressed." Shaq didn't respond. He simply nodded once before turning back to his mother. "Ready to go, Mama?" Lucille nodded, slipping her hand back into the crook of his arm. Together, they walked toward the elevator, leaving behind the weight of what had just unfolded. And as the doors slid shut behind them, the lobby remained still, the impact of Shaq's words lingering in the air like an aftershock. The hush in the Grand Horizon Hotel lobby was suffocating. Eyes darted between the towering figure of Shaquille O'Neal and the visibly trembling Chase Donovan, who now looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff with no way back. Shaq exhaled slowly, finally lifting his hands to pull back the hood that had concealed his face. The moment his identity was fully revealed, a wave of gasps rippled through the room. A few guests audibly muttered his name, their whispers turning into a low hum of shock. Chase's eyes widened with horror. He had spent the last several minutes not only humiliating an elderly woman, but also doing so in front of one of the most famous and respected men in the world. His breath hitched, and for the first time, he realized that his mistake wasn't just a private embarrassment, it was about to become a public disaster. I didn't know," Chase stammered, taking a step back, his usual arrogance crumbling. "I didn't realize..." Shaq's expression remained unreadable, his eyes locked onto Chase with an intensity that made the younger man squirm. "Didn't realize what?" Chase swallowed. His mouth opened, but words failed him. Shaq tilted his head slightly. "That she was my mother?" he asked, his voice steady, unwavering. "Would that have changed how you treated her?" Chase paled further. He knew there was no right answer to that question. Victoria Langley, still standing stiffly beside the front desk, saw the entire situation spiraling out of control. She could feel the weight of every guest's gaze, the heat of their judgment now turning toward her as well. If she didn't act fast, this hotel's reputation, her reputation, would be in ruins. Her lips parted, her mind scrambling for damage control. "Mr. O'Neal," she started, carefully choosing her words. "I want to personally apologize on behalf of Grand Horizon. This is not how we treat our guests, and I assure you, immediate action will be taken." She turned sharply toward Chase, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms. "Chase," she said, her tone icy, "you are fired. Effective immediately." A few guests let out murmurs of approval. Some hotel staff exchanged glances, some relieved, others uneasy. Chase's entire body tensed. He whipped his head toward Victoria, his face twisted with desperation. "Wait, Victoria, please," he pleaded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I made a mistake. I didn't know who she was. I swear, if I had known." Shaq's eyes darkened, and he took a single step forward, cutting Chase off with nothing more than his sheer presence. "That's the problem," Shaq said quietly. "You didn't have to know who she was. You just had to treat her like a person." Chase flinched at the words. Shaq shook his head, his disappointment more powerful than anger. "You looked at my mother, and you saw someone beneath you. Someone not worth your time. That's not a mistake. That's a mindset." Chase opened his mouth again, then closed it. He had no defense. Shaq exhaled and turned to Victoria. "Firing him doesn't fix the problem." Victoria stiffened, caught off guard. Excuse me?" "Chase is a symptom, not the disease," Shaq said, his voice calm but firm. "He didn't create this culture. He just learned from it." A murmur spread through the guests. Some nodded in quiet agreement. Others shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Shaq turned back to Chase. "I'm not asking you for an apology," he said, "because if it's not real, it doesn't mean anything." Chase swallowed, his throat tight, his humiliation now mixed with something deeper, shame. Lucille O'Neal, who had been silent until now, finally stepped forward. Her presence, though quiet, carried a different kind of power. She looked Chase in the eyes, and for the first time, he was forced to hold the gaze of the woman he had belittled. "I've met people like you before," Lucille said, her voice soft but unshakable. "People who think they can tell someone's worth just by looking at them. And let me tell you something, young man. Life has a way of humbling people like you." Chase blinked rapidly, his face growing hotter with every passing second. Lucille's expression didn't hold anger, just wisdom. "You thought I was beneath you because of how I look, because I don't wear diamonds or walk in here with an entourage. But let me tell you what I do have." She glanced at Shaq, her lips curving into a small, knowing smile before turning back to Chase. "I have a son who's not just rich, not just famous, but respected. And do you know why?" Chase shook his head slightly, as if unsure if he should answer. "Because he treats people with kindness, with dignity, with the same respect whether they're a janitor or a CEO." Chase's throat bobbed again. Lucille sighed, glancing around the room. "A man is measured not by his wealth but by his heart. And what I saw in you today, young man, wasn't wealth. It wasn't power. It was insecurity dressed up as arrogance." The words struck Chase harder than he expected. He had thought himself powerful, standing behind that desk, deciding who was worthy and who wasn't. But right now, standing before this elderly woman, he had never felt smaller. Shaq studied Chase for a long moment. "You got two choices," he finally said. "You can walk out of here mad, embarrassed, blaming everybody but yourself, or—" He let the word hang, letting Chase reach for the second option himself. Chase swallowed hard. "Or?" he asked, barely above a whisper. "Or you can do better," Shaq said simply. Chase stood there, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. The easy thing would be to storm out, to call this whole situation unfair, to pretend like none of it mattered. But something about the way Shaq and Lucille looked at him made him realize the truth. This was his moment. The moment that would either define him or destroy him. He dropped his gaze, his shoulders slumping ever so slightly. "I don't know how to fix it," he admitted, his voice raw. Lucille gave a soft smile. "You start by listening." Shaq nodded. "And by treating the next person who walks through those doors like they belong." A silence stretched between them, not as heavy as before, but full of something new. Growth. Shaq turned back to his mother. "You ready to go, Mama?" Lucille looped her arm through his and smiled. "I've been ready, baby." Together, they walked toward the elevator, leaving behind a man who had just been given a rare gift, a second chance. The video hit the internet before Shaq and Lucille even reached their suite. It started with a single post. A guest in the lobby had filmed the entire encounter and uploaded it with the caption, "Hotel concierge insults elderly guest, has no idea she's Shaquille O'Neal's mother." Within minutes, the post exploded. Retweets, shares, captions dissecting every moment of Chase Donovan's humiliation. Comments poured in, some condemning, some analyzing, others simply in disbelief. She showed him the reservation, and he still refused her service? If Shaq hadn't been there, she would have been thrown out. Think about that. This is what privilege looks like, thinking you get to decide who belongs somewhere. By the time Shaq stepped into the suite with his mother, his phone was vibrating nonstop. He glanced down at the notifications. His name was already trending. Lucille set her handbag down carefully, sighing as she eased into the chair by the window. She glanced over at her son, her sharp eyes catching the flicker of frustration in his expression. "Let me guess," she said. "It's everywhere, isn't it?" Shaq exhaled through his nose, tossing his phone onto the table. "Yeah." Lucille chuckled softly, shaking her head. Not surprised. Shaq wasn't either. He knew how the world worked. A story like this, celebrity mother mistreated, son steps in, was clickbait gold. But beyond the headlines, he knew what the real conversation would be about. Racism, privilege, who gets the benefit of the doubt and who doesn't. Downstairs, Grand Horizon Hotel was in crisis mode. Victoria Langley sat in her office, her phone ringing endlessly, her inbox flooded with emails from corporate executives demanding an explanation. The hotel's official statement was already being drafted, full of carefully chosen words. "We do not tolerate discrimination. We deeply regret the incident. We are committed to diversity and inclusion." But Victoria knew that words weren't enough. The damage had been done. The video had over 1 million views within hours. It wasn't just Twitter. News outlets picked it up, dissecting every moment. Morning talk shows replayed the clip, featuring panels of experts discussing racial bias in customer service. Opinion pieces flooded online publications. Why this Shaquille O'Neal incident is bigger than basketball. Black wealth doesn't erase racism, a reminder from Grand Horizon Hotel. The pressure mounted. Calls for Chase's firing turned into demands for broader accountability. People started digging into the hotel's history, questioning its hiring practices, its guest policies. Then, Chase Donovan's name hit the internet. And things got even worse. The internet is ruthless. It took less than a day for old tweets to resurface. Posts from Chase's college days where he made offhand racist jokes, casually demeaning people of color. Screenshots of his past comments circulated like wildfire, fueling the narrative that his actions at the hotel weren't just a mistake. They were part of a pattern. You don't just suddenly become racist one day. Chase Donovan got comfortable being this way. Former co-workers from previous jobs chimed in anonymously, sharing stories about his dismissive attitude toward minority customers. Not surprised. He always treated black guests like they were less than, unless they were obviously rich. The backlash wasn't just online. Chase's email was flooded with hate messages. His phone rang with calls from unknown numbers, some threatening, some just wanting to scream at him. He locked his social media accounts, but it was too late. His name was a national scandal. By nightfall, he was unemployable. His friends stopped answering his calls. His former colleagues distanced themselves. Even his parents, who had always told him he was special, destined for success, didn't know what to say. Chase sat alone in his apartment, the glow of his laptop screen illuminating the articles tearing him apart. His career was over. and he had no one to blame but himself. Meanwhile, the world waited for Shaquille O'Neal to respond. His PR team urged him to release a statement to capitalize on the moment. Brands reached out, offering to partner with him on anti-discrimination campaigns. Activists wanted him to speak at rallies. But Shaq didn't want revenge. He wasn't interested in canceling Chase. He wanted people to understand. So instead of a press conference, he did what he did best. He sat down in front of his phone camera and spoke directly to the people. The video was simple. No fancy production, no dramatic background. Just Shaq, looking straight into the camera, his voice low and steady. "I've seen a lot of stuff online today," he started. "A lot of people talking about what happened to my mom. Talking about Chase." He paused. "I get it. Y'all are mad. I was mad too." He exhaled, rubbing his hands together before continuing. "But here's the thing," he said. "This ain't just about Chase. This is about how we see people. How we decide who's worthy of respect and who isn't. How we judge folks before they even open their mouth." The comments flooded in. "He's right. It's bigger than just one guy." Shaq always been about wisdom. Listen to this man. Shaq leaned forward slightly. "Some of y'all asking if I wanted him fired. That ain't my call. But let me ask you something. What's gonna change if we just fire him and move on? Somebody else just like him is gonna take his place, and the cycle keeps going." He let the words sink in before finishing. "We gotta start treating people better, no matter what they look like, no matter if they got money or not, no matter if they famous or not." He paused. That's the lesson here. The video broke the internet. It was shared across every platform, getting millions of views. People who were ready to burn Chase's career to the ground suddenly stopped to think. Conversations shifted from outrage to reflection, and that was exactly what Shaq wanted. In the days that followed, Grand Horizon Hotel announced major changes: mandatory bias training for all employees, increased diversity in hiring, and a new set of policies aimed at ensuring guests of all backgrounds were treated with equal respect. Shaq didn't let them off the hook easily. He met with the hotel's board, pushing them to do more, to go beyond PR damage control, and actually implement real change. As for Chase Donovan, he disappeared from public view. Last anyone heard, he was living with a friend, struggling to find work, his once promising career in luxury hospitality reduced to dust. But some people wondered, was this really the end for him? Or would he somehow take the lesson he had been forced to learn and become better? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain: the world was watching. Chase Donovan sat in his dimly lit apartment, staring at the unopened emails on his laptop. Each subject line felt like a nail in the coffin of his former life. Termination notice. Final paycheck statement. Urgent. Removal from hotel industry roster. He had become radioactive. Once he had been the golden boy of Grand Horizon, a concierge with a bright future, rubbing elbows with billionaires, ensuring that only the right kind of people stayed at the hotel. Now he was unemployed, disgraced, and the face of online shame. He had tried to delete his social media, but it was too late. The damage was done. His inbox overflowed with hate mail. Strangers had tracked down his old posts, his careless words from years ago, and dragged them into the light. Each headline stung like a fresh wound. Chase Donovan, a career destroyed by one arrogant mistake. A lesson in privilege, the concierge who thought he was untouchable. His hands clenched into fists. He wanted to fight back, to scream that this wasn't fair, that he was just doing his job, that he wasn't a bad person, that he had been unfairly labeled. But deep down, he knew. This wasn't about one mistake. This was about the way he had seen the world, the way he had treated people he deemed unworthy. And now, for the first time, he was on the other side of the equation, and it felt unbearable. A week after his firing, Chase's phone rang. He almost didn't answer. But when he saw the caller ID, his breath caught. Shaquille O'Neal. For a moment, he just stared at the screen, his fingers hovering over the decline button. Why was Shaq calling him? To rub salt in the wound? To give him another lecture? Against his better judgment, he answered. Hello? His voice was hoarse from lack of sleep. There was a pause before Shaq spoke. How you holding up? Chase closed his eyes. The question felt too real, too undeserved. "How do you think?" he muttered. Shaq didn't sound angry. He didn't even sound smug. His voice was calm, even. "I've been where you are." Chase almost laughed. "Number you haven't." "You think I never made mistakes?" Shaq asked. "You think I never let my ego mess things up for me?" Chase rubbed his temple. "Maybe, but your mistakes didn't cost you everything." Shaq was quiet for a moment. "Didn't they?" Chase frowned. "I lost friends over my pride." Shaq continued. "Lost opportunities because I thought I was too big to listen. And you know what? Nobody's perfect. But the question is, what do you do now?" Chase swallowed hard. "I don't know." "Well," Shaq said, "I might have an idea." Chase sat up straighter. "What do you mean?" Shaq exhaled. "I don't believe in tearing people down just to leave them there. You messed up. Bad. But I don't think you're beyond saving." Chase let out a humorless laugh. "You sure about that? Because the whole world seems to think I am." "The world loves to cancel people," Shaq said. "But real redemption? That's on you." Chase frowned. "And what? You're offering me a way out?" Shaq didn't hesitate. "I'm offering you a way forward." Chase's heart pounded. "I have a foundation," Shaq explained. "We do a lot of work in underprivileged communities. Mentorship, scholarships, outreach programs. We teach young kids respect, leadership, and how to carry themselves with dignity, no matter where they come from." Chase felt a lump in his throat, but he didn't speak. "You want to fix what you broke?" Shaq continued. "You come work for me. Learn something real. Help people instead of tearing them down. But if you do this, you do it right. No shortcuts, no PR stunt, no fake apologies." Chase blinked, his mind struggling to catch up. "Why would you help me?" Shaq's voice was steady. "Because my mama raised me to believe that people can change. And because this ain't just about you. It's about all the people like you who don't get checked until it's too late." Chase felt a wave of something unfamiliar crash over him. Shame, gratitude, something deeper than either. "Think about it," Shaq said. "But don't take too long." Then, just as simply as he had called, he hung up, leaving Chase alone with the biggest decision of his life. That night, Chase couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the moment in the hotel lobby, the way Shaquille O'Neal had looked at him. Not with anger, not even with disgust, with pity. Her words echoed in his head. "A man is measured not by his wealth but by his heart." He had spent his whole life thinking respect was something he had the power to give or take away, that certain people were worth his time and others weren't. But what had that gotten him? He had been at the top, untouchable. And now, he was a man with nothing. Lucille had seen it coming before he had. She had known the fall was inevitable. And now, she and Shaq were offering him a lifeline, not a free pass, a test. As dawn broke, Chase sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone. He could still walk away. He could blame everyone else, say the world was unfair, that he had been set up, that social media had destroyed his life. He could let his pride consume him, or he could try, really, truly try. With a deep breath, Chase picked up his phone, scrolled through his contacts, and pressed call. The line rang twice before Shaq answered. "You think about it?" Chase inhaled sharply. "Yeah." A pause. "I want to try." Shaq's voice was unreadable. "You sure?" "No," Chase admitted. "But I don't want this to be the end of me." There was silence on the other end. Then Shaq exhaled. "All right," he said. "Let's get to work." And just like that, Chase Donovan took his first step toward redemption. The Grand Horizon Hotel was no longer the same. In the weeks following the incident, corporate pressure and public scrutiny forced change. What had once been a pristine symbol of exclusivity now found itself at the center of a nationwide discussion about bias, privilege, and respect. A new policy was announced: mandatory sensitivity and anti-bias training for all employees. Hiring practices were revised, ensuring diversity in leadership and staff. Guest service protocols were overhauled, emphasizing dignity over discrimination. Victoria Langley, desperate to salvage the hotel's reputation, had no choice but to personally oversee these reforms. She made public statements, appeared on talk shows, and assured the world that Grand Horizon had learned from its mistakes. But it wasn't just about the hotel anymore. Because Shaquille O'Neal had turned the moment into a movement, Shaq could have walked away after that day. He could have let the media storm run its course, let the hotel deal with its fallout, and moved on. But he didn't. Instead, he used the incident as a catalyst for something bigger. He launched a campaign called Dignity First, aimed at challenging how service industries treated their customers, regardless of race, class, or background. The way you treat people says everything about you, so let's do better. Shaquille O'Neal, in an Instagram post that garnered over 10 million likes. He partnered with advocacy groups, donated to organizations working to combat discrimination, and made public appearances to speak about unconscious bias in customer service. Corporations took notice. Luxury brands, hotels, and restaurants across the country started reevaluating their policies, knowing that one viral moment could ruin them overnight. And at the heart of it all was Shaq's simple but powerful message. Respect isn't earned. It's given. To everyone. Meanwhile, Chase Donovan had vanished from the public eye. After his life imploded, he disappeared from social media, cut ties with former colleagues, and started over. But starting over wasn't easy. The job rejections piled up. Every time an employer saw his name, they hesitated. His past followed him like a shadow. Yet something had shifted inside him. Instead of blaming the world, Chase finally started looking inward. For months, he worked under Shaq's foundation, keeping a low profile, learning the hard way what it meant to serve others instead of himself. He visited schools in underprivileged neighborhoods, talking to kids about respect and humility. He spent time with young workers in the hospitality industry, hearing their stories of bias and mistreatment, experiences he had once been blind to. One day, while helping organize a community event, he overheard two volunteers whispering, "Hey, isn't that the guy from the hotel scandal?" "Yeah, weird, right? He's actually working hard." That was the first time Chase realized he wasn't invisible anymore, but for a different reason. People weren't watching to see him fail. They were watching to see if he could truly change. And for the first time, he wanted to prove them right. One evening, Shaq and his mother sat together on the patio of their home. The sky was painted in streaks of orange and pink, the breeze warm but gentle. Lucille sipped her tea, looking at her son with quiet pride. "You did something good, baby." Shaq chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "I just called out what needed to be called out." Lucille shook her head, smiling. "No, you did more than that. You taught. You didn't just drag that boy. You gave him a way to stand back up." Shaq exhaled, rubbing his hands together. "You really think he'll change?" Lucille set her cup down. "I think life humbled him. And when life humbles you, you either grow or you wither." Shaq nodded, thinking about Chase's journey. The man had a long road ahead, but at least he was walking in the right direction now. Lucille patted Shaq's arm, her voice gentle but firm. "Remember, baby, true wealth isn't in money. It's in character, in how you treat people. That's the only thing that lasts." Shaq looked at his mother, his heart full. "I learned that from you." She smiled, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "Then I did my job." The world eventually moved on. New scandals took over the news cycle. The internet found new villains and new heroes. But some things stuck. Grand Horizon never went back to its old ways. Its leadership changed, its policies remained. And guests of every background noticed the difference. Shaq's Dignity First movement expanded, gaining supporters across industries, shaping policies that would outlive any viral moment. And Chase? He wasn't famous. He didn't seek headlines. But he kept working, kept learning, kept proving in small, quiet ways that he was no longer the man he used to be. And somewhere in the world, an elderly woman walked into a luxury hotel and was greeted with warmth, respect, and dignity. Not because she was wealthy, not because she was connected, but because she was human. And that was the real victory. Some lessons come easy. Others? They shake the world. What happens when power, prejudice, and humility collide in one unforgettable moment? This isn't just a story, it's a reality check. Would you have acted differently? Or are you just one moment away from your own reckoning? Watch, reflect, and ask yourself, what do you see when you look at someone?